Hey everyone, welcome to my second of 3 videos on the Nikon D60. In the first video we talked about what everything was. In this video we'll cover all of the functions for the camera except the menus and configuration, but we'll go through everything else that's on the outside of this camera. Being a digital camera, this can do nothing whatsoever without a battery. So the first thing we're going to do is change the battery. Access the battery, you simply push this release back and lift it up, and here's the battery. The battery doesn't spring out, you need gravity. There we go. The Nikon D60 uses an ENEL9 battery. I don't think Nikon still makes these, but third-party options are available and they work really well in these cameras, so that's what I use. Anyway, to load the battery, it can only go in one way. There's this like lip here, and there's a different shape on these two corners. So you contact side down, this lip goes toward the inside of the camera at this side of the battery chamber. Slide it in, close the door, and we've changed the battery. Next up, let's talk about changing lenses on the Nikon D60. All you have to do to remove a lens is push down on the lens release button, turn the lens clockwise until it stops, and then remove it. To mount a lens, white dot to white dot, mount the lens, turn it till it clicks, and you've mounted a new lens. Let's take a look at the lens mount really quickly and talk about it. Now, if you're familiar with Nikon cameras, you might notice that there is no aperture coupling ring here. That means that this camera can safely mount an NAI lens. It can also mount AI lens and AID lenses, but the autofocus screw drive lenses like the AIDs, there's no screw drive autofocus down here. So this camera cannot do autofocus with those, but it can use them. All right. With the this camera also has a mechanical aperture coupling right here, so it can stop down the apertures on the NAI and pre-AI NAI lenses and AI lenses. So with those, you can use stop-down metering, which is to say you use this button up here to close the aperture, dial in manual settings with those, and then you can take a photo with those in full manual mode. That is a thing you can do if you are interested in vintage lenses. However, the D60 was really designed to work with DX format G lenses like this one, ones that say G after the name, okay? This type of lens will work specifically really well with this camera, so these are the things you want to look for: DX format and G, and that's really what this camera is looking for. The manual focus option is doable, but very hard with the optical viewfinder specs this camera has. Next up, let's talk about SD cards with the D60. So to access the SD card, you simply open this door here, and that's where the SD cards go. This is a 64 gigabyte card. Now, according to my notes, which should have come from the manual or Nikon resources on this, the D60 can accept 64 gig memory cards as the largest memory card. However, this memory card actually won't work in it, and the reason for that is because this is an SDXC memory card. The D60 can take up to SDHC memory cards, which typically only come up to 32 gigs in size. As I'm recording this video, SDHC 32 gig memory cards run like $7 to $8 a piece. They're pretty affordable, and each one of those will hold approximately 2,500 RAW files. So if you wanted to just pick up like a few of the 32 gig SDHC SD cards, you would be in good shape with this camera. To mount an SD card, you simply slide it into the SD card slot here with the label side toward the back of the camera, push it in, close the door, and the camera is going to work. And because that was SDXC, I was getting a format error on the memory card. That's what happens with SDXC memory cards. To remove the card, push the door open, push the card in, and it will eject. And now you can remove the card and copy the files from it onto your computer. Okay, so next up, let's talk about flash use. The first bit of advice I have for you on a flash is going to be, with any digital camera, get an OEM flash, which is to say a flash made by that maker for your system. Okay, for this camera, get a Nikon flash. It's gonna work better. You'll get all the features, auto exposure metering, focus assist light. You'll get all the automatic controls. You'll also get manual controls. It's just a lot easier with a digital camera system because of how much these can do, to just get a first-party flash. So that's the first tip. The second tip I'm going to give you is I'm going to give you some tips about flash technique, okay? With a flash, when you think about the way that we see the world, we always see it lit from above, outside during the day, outside at night with street lights, indoors with overhead lighting. So with a flash, you want to replicate that. If you set your flash right on top of your camera here, and you fire the flash at your subject, a wall of light's going to leave the flash and come back to the lens of your camera, and your subjects are going to look very flat and waxy. If you don't have red eye prevention turned on, they're also going to have red eyes, and no one looks good with that. With flash use, what you want to do is think about the way that we see the world, which is usually lit from above, and that's what we think of as being normal and flattering, and replicate that with your flash. So with the D60, the only way you can connect the flash is by putting it on the hot shoe. There's no external flash connection. You need to mount it there. So one thing you can do when you buy your flash is make sure that the head tilts at minimum, that the head tilts up. This way you can you can bounce the flash off of a ceiling, and then you can have that overhead light that looks much softer and is much more flattering to your subjects. Even better, this flash doesn't do it, but get a flash with a swiveling head as well. So if you don't have a ceiling, or the ceiling's very high, you can swivel the flash toward the wall, point it up just a little bit, and mimic that overhead lighting pretty closely, and still have a really nice flattering look to your images. That's, I think, the best tip I can give you, is when it comes to flash, get a first-party flash and mimic natural lighting with it to the best of your ability, and you will have photos that flatter your subject as well as possible. Now, with that, let's talk about what next. We're going to talk about what's on the mode dial here, okay? So this is the mode dial index. It's going to point at the mode we're discussing. We're going to start here at Magic Green Camera. We're going to go through the creative modes, and we're going to go through the scene modes last. These creative modes, if you have come here to learn to be a better photographer, are the ones you want to spend most of your time in, okay? Magic Green Camera is fine if this is your first time grabbing a digital SLR at all, or this camera, and you're stepping up especially from, say, a cell phone, and you want to learn how to use the camera. This basically turns your camera into a cell phone. You have no control over how the camera functions with Magic Green Camera. What you can do is just compose the image and take it. This does everything for you, okay? Just like a cell phone would. So if you're graduating from that, come here, learn where the buttons are, learn some of the functions, and then after probably a few days or a week at most, you might find yourself getting limited by that and wanting to try some of these other modes. So let's figure out what they are. First mode is program. This starts to give you some of your control back. With program mode, what you can do is the camera will pick the best shutter speed and aperture. You can, if you would like to, pop up the flash, okay? You have that control. You can set your ISO very easily. You could also use auto ISO, that's fine. And in program mode, you also have a really nifty trick I'm going to show you right here called program shifting, okay? So right now we know that program wants to do 1/30th at f3.5. If I rotate the command wheel, if I hold the AV button and rotate the command wheel, no. If I just, come on guys, this is supposed to work. Some configuration is not correct with this camera, and I'm not sure which one it is. In theory, that should have worked, and I don't know why it's not. So program mode allows you to do that program shifting somehow. There's a configuration item, maybe we'll figure it out. And yeah, so that's the main difference between green auto and program mode. You start getting some control back. S and A are called your semi-automatic, not because that's S&A, modes. Everything from program through night portrait over here, that's pretty much an automatic mode. S stands for shutter priority. And on the Nikon D60, shutter priority allows you to control the shutter speed right back here, and then the camera will pick the best aperture for you. So I'm going to show you on the back what that looks like. And as I rotate the command wheel here, you can see that the shutter speed is changing, and as the shutter speed changes, so does the aperture, okay? If I get to a shutter speed where there is not enough light, what's going to happen is that the F should blink. There's the question mark down here. The question mark is telling you that something's going on. There it goes. It says low. It said low for a second. That's what it's supposed to say. What this does is this tells you that there is not enough light for the shutter speed that you've selected with the ISO that you have selected for the camera to give you an appropriate exposure. Your image is going to be very dark. So you can do that quite easily in shutter priority mode because the aperture range on a lens is relatively limited compared to the shutter speed range that this camera can give you. One other thing you can do in shutter priority mode is that if you look down here, you can see that it's giving me shutter speeds now. I'm going to hold the AV button down and then I'm going to rotate the command wheel, and you can see that underneath the shutter and aperture information, there is a light meter now. And there's a bar at the bottom of it that's increasing in different directions. And the aperture is changing, but not the shutter speed. What I'm doing is what's called exposure value compensation. And if you look on the bottom of the screen, you can see there's a box around that information on the left. And as I make this adjustment, it changes as well, okay? So this allows you to, let's say that you are wanting to do a bracketed series of photos for an HDR. Here you go, you could do one that's a stop over, one that's properly exposed, and one that's a stop under. And the camera will keep your shutter speed the same, but it will adjust the aperture as you do that, okay? So that's, in shutter priority mode, the camera will always keep your shutter speed the same. So that's how you use manual exposure manual exposure compensation in shutter priority mode to achieve different effects. If you're using shutter priority mode and you're out in the mountains, let's say, and it's snowy and you're skiing and all of your images are super bright, you can intentionally underexpose your images just a little bit so that you get proper exposure, or vice versa. If all of your snow looks really muddy, you can intentionally overexpose your images for the same reason. And with shutter priority, your shutter speed will be what you want, and the aperture will be used for that compensation. Aperture priority mode is where you control the aperture and the camera can control the shutter speed. So if we come back here to the back and I rotate the command wheel, you can see that both the aperture and shutter speed are changing. Now with aperture priority mode, you almost cannot run out of shutter speeds because of how many there are on this. If you're shooting in full sun with something like an f1.2 lens, which this lens is not, at 3200 ISO, yeah, you'll have something blinking over here, or it'll say hi, whatever it is. But it's much harder to run out of exposure range with aperture priority than it is with shutter priority, okay? And if I hold down the aperture, the AV button here on top, you'll notice that I can intentionally overexpose or intentionally underexpose my images as well, okay? So I can do the exact same trick that we just talked about with exposure compensation, manual exposure compensation, by changing the setting here. And you'll notice as I do this in aperture priority mode, the aperture always stays the same and the shutter speed is what changes for exposure compensation. Next up, we're going to talk about full manual mode. In full manual mode, you have full control over everything. The camera will use the shutter speed and aperture that you want, and if they're correct and the exposure turns out, it's your fault. And if they are incorrect and the exposure is way too dark or way too bright, it's also your fault. The camera will do what you say, whether or not it is correct. So let's take a look at the back here, and you can see that the meter reading right now actually has a little line underneath the 0. That means that we have a correct exposure for this photo, and it's going to turn out well. But if I rotate the rear command wheel, I can adjust the shutter speed. And now I'm getting too little light. So if I took this photo, it would be way too dark. If I keep rotating it, you can see that triangle way over on the side is lit up. That means I have way too little light. My image is going to be very dark. Okay, and we don't want to have an image that's very dark unless we're doing that on purpose. The exact opposite is true. I could make the shutter speed way too long, and now it's going to be way overexposed, okay? So we don't want to have that either. So your goal with manual exposures is to adjust your shutter speed and aperture until the meter shows a single bar underneath the 0, not like that, like that. And that's a proper exposure, and that's when you can take your photo. Now, I was only adjusting the shutter speed. How is this not shutter priority mode? If I hold down the AV button on top, now I can adjust the aperture. And as I adjust the aperture, you can see the light meter is now also changing. So if I don't want to use 1.3 seconds for my shutter speed, I want to use something faster, I can give myself a larger aperture and adjust the shutter speed now to a ½ second, and that's going to give me a proper exposure as well. So your goal with the full manual is to have a single line under the 0, and whatever shutter speed and aperture you use to get there, you have to be happy with. Okay, that's how you use full manual. Now let's go through the scene modes, okay? And we're gonna start here underneath magic green camera with no flash. No flash is magical green camera, but the flash is disabled and won't pop up, and you won't trigger a flash in your hot shoe. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. Next up, we have portrait. Portrait mode tells the camera, I'm going to be taking a photo of a person. So the camera is going to apply some algorithms that make your portrait more flattering for people. Some things you can do to set this up to be successful is shoot at the long end of your kit zoom length, so 70 millimeters on this camera. If you have, say, the 55 to 200 millimeter zoom, something in the 100 to 135 range will work very well on that zoom. What the camera is going to try to do is give you an aperture that will have your person subject be in focus, but the background be out of focus. You can help the camera do that with a longer focal length and by having your subject be about 8 to 10 feet in front of the background that they're standing in front of. Further, of course, is better, but that will help the camera give you a nice blurry background with an in-focus subject. Next up, we have landscape. The way landscape works is you're telling the camera, I'm going to take a photo of a landscape. And what you can do to help the camera there is shoot at the wide end of your kit zoom range. 18 millimeters would be perfect with this camera. The camera is going to give you a small aperture for a deep depth of field, so that things that are right in front of the lens and things that are infinity focus away will both be in focus, okay? With your landscape photo, a really good way to structure a basic landscape photo so that it's visually appealing is to put something very close up here in the foreground at the bottom of your image, something mid-distance here in the middle of the image, so like the foreground could be rocks or flowers or something. The background here could be like a lake or a forest, and then something up here in the top would be like mountains or clouds, and they're very far away. What that does is give your image a lot of depth, close up and far away, so there's visual interest there for your viewer. This next one is called kids. Kids tells the camera, I'm going to be photographing kids. You should totally expect them to run around a lot and barf. And so what the camera is going to do is set up the autofocus so that it will track moving subjects, and yeah, you can photograph your kids. Next one is called action or sports. What this is going to do is it's going to tell the camera to give you the fastest shutter speed it can, and that it's going to be trying to freeze motion with its settings. With your lens, if you have the kit zoom, the longer the focal length, the better. Action really works very well with a prime lens in the something like 200 millimeter range, or a faster, longer lens, because it needs a little bit of extra speed to freeze motion and give you a fast shutter speed. The 55 to 200 millimeter zoom is another example for this, would also work very well, especially on the longer end of that. Basically, the difference between, as I understand it, between kids and sports is that kids, the camera assumes you're going to be closer to them, and sports, the camera assumes you're going to be further away. Close-up mode here, the camera assumes you're going to be very close to your subject. And again, this is another one where something on like this lens in the 50 to 70 millimeter range would work really well with close-ups. The camera here is going to use the closer focal ranges of your focal points of your lens, and look for something that's close to you to take a photo of. And lastly, we have night portrait, which is a singular use mode that takes a portrait of a person at night. And what this does is this assumes you're going to have something like a cityscape behind the photo, behind a person that you're taking a photo of. So this will give you a long exposure, and it will trigger the flash. With this, what you want to do to make it successful is have a tripod, and your tripod is going to, then you're going to compose your image so that your subject is in front of the cityscape. Tell your subject the flash is going to fire, but it's going to be a long exposure, so don't move until I tell you to. What will happen is that this mode will give you a longer exposure. It could be a half second, it could be 5 seconds. I don't know the exact range for it. But and then the flash will fire as well. If the flash fires at the very beginning of the photo and your subject gets up and the photo goes on for another 5 or 10 seconds, all of the lights from the city that were behind your subject will show through them on the image. It's going to be a very weird look. So that's why when you take this photo, you tell your subject, even if the flash fires right away, stay seated until the photo's over, and I'll tell you when to stand up, and then then your subject will be illuminated and the cityscape will be visible. And so those are all of the modes All right, let's talk about the last couple of buttons on the top here. We have the EV comp button. We saw how this works in aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual mode right here. This is your active de-lighting button, okay? Active dynamic lighting. So let's come around to the back of the camera, and I'm gonna push the active dynamic lighting button, and I want you to look right here. And you can see that now I can, if I use the rear command wheel, switch between on and off. The one purpose of this button is to allow you to come back here and turn active de-lighting on or off. What is active de-lighting? Sort of like HDR light. Basically, it was a way of capturing more shadow and more highlight detail for JPEG shooters. So honestly, if you're here to learn to be a better photographer and you want to do some editing of your photos, you're going to be shooting raw. Active de-lighting is not going to do that much for you because you can do even more with your raw files in post by adjusting the contrast, highlight and shadow sliders on your raw files than you can with active de-lighting for this camera. So it's a thing the camera can do. It's not necessarily something that is going to be beneficial for most people, but if you are shooting JPEGs and you want to use active de-lighting, that's how you use it. While we have this screen up, let's talk about the info button on the back, which is right here. And I'm going to use the control pad. And when you push the info button, you can access all of these different items and adjust them as you want to. Okay, so let's talk about what all of these are. Here is flash. You have these bunch of different modes on the flash. Actually, there's a few more modes here than the D40X. That's some good differences in here. Okay, I'm gonna go up to the top. We're gonna select, dang it. We're gonna select standard flash. The camera will use the flash as it sees fit to give you a proper exposure. Basically with this, it can do a fill flash, it can do a full power flash, whatever it needs for a proper exposure. You're giving the camera some control here, and there's no problem with that. This is quite honestly a lot of the time I use flash. That's the mode it's in. This is flash red eye. The camera will pulse the flash before it takes the photo to shrink the pupils on your human subjects and reduce red eye. This next one is flash red eye with slow sync. What this means is it will do that red eye pulse and give you a long exposure. And so this is good in like a dark setting where your subjects are relatively stationary. You can take a photo, let's say you're at a wedding, okay, and behind the subject, you've got this like table full of lights and cake and gifts or whatever, okay? And so you use this mode. The camera will pulse the flash to shrink the subject's pupils to reduce red eye. Then it will take the photo with the full flash and a longer shutter speed. The flash will illuminate your subjects. The longer shutter speed will capture the light of the candles and the cake and the gifts so that everything's more evenly illuminated. That's an example of how to use that one. Slow shutter speed is what we just described, but without the red eye pulse. And rear curtain is an interesting one, okay? So to understand this, we first have to understand how a flash normally works. And with any camera, let's assume, because it's easier to demonstrate, that the curtains on this camera go left to right. Really, they go up and down. But when you take a photo with standard flash sync, the shutter curtain opens and it travels across the sensor, and when it reaches the far side, the flash fires. At that point, the second curtain comes along and closes, and then the curtains reset for the next photo. With your flash sync speed of 1/200th, at 1/200th of a second, that first curtain opens, the entire sensor is open to light for about 1/200th of a second, close, reset, okay? Rear curtain and standard does not matter one bit at your flash sync speed. With rear curtain, what happens is instead of the flash firing when the first curtain finishes travel, the entire sensor area is exposed to light for about 1/200th. The second curtain, or the flash fires, and then the second curtain comes in, and then they reset. So that's why at your sync speed, it doesn't matter. If you're using bulb mode or taking a 10-second photo or something like that, now it matters. All right, so let me give you an example of how this could work with a long exposure. So let's say you've got your friend and they're gonna run through the frame here, and they're wearing they're just decked out in fairy lights. Okay, with standard sync, what's gonna happen is as they're running in here, you're gonna click the shutter, The shutter is going to open, the flash will fire right away, and then for as long as the shutter is open, they'll be illuminated, of course, on the photo because the flash fired, but then all the lights will appear to come from them and shoot forward, and then the photo will end, okay? The open sensor will keep recording the light after the flash fires. With rear curtain sync, you'll start your friend will come running in, you'll start the photo, the camera will start by recording the light that's wrapped around them. The flash will not fire until you let go of the shutter button, and the flash will then fire, illuminate your friend, and capture them, and then the second curtain will close. And that second image, your friend will be illuminated, and the lights will be coming off as a trailing behind them. So that's an example of how standard and rear curtain can be used to a creative effect and the difference in how they work. Here is your exposure compensation dial. With this, you can manually adjust your exposure compensation, and you get a ton of exposure compensation, up to 5 stops over and up to 5 stops under. If this is what a normal photo is going to look like, if you overexpose it, it's going to keep getting brighter and brighter and brighter until it's just super bright. If you underexpose it, it's going to get darker and darker and darker until it's just super dark, okay? So you can see here, this is what exposure compensation does, and you can do it at any point in the modes that allow it. Next up, this is a very similar looking symbol, isn't it? This is exposure compensation for your flash. With this, you can increase your flash's brightness by up to 1 stop or decrease it by up to 3 stops. So what's this good for? Let's assume that you are at 0. You're just using your flash at normal brightness, and you're taking a picture of a person who's holding like a champagne glass, right? And that flash is glaring off the champagne glass. Well, if you intentionally dim it just a little bit, maybe that glare won't be so bad, and now you'll be able to catch that champagne glass without it being like this blinding bright light in the photo. Or let's say you're at a party and you're taking photos of that party and you're shooting your flash, and yeah, the people right in front of you are illuminated, but there's like people 10 feet behind. You'd like to get them in the photo too, but they're just not showing up. Well, you can overclock your flash, give it more light, and now in that dark setting, things that are further away from the camera will be illuminated as well. Those are a couple examples of how that can be used. We talked about ADL. We'll go up here to the top and talk about the easy ones first. This is your image quality, okay? If we select this, we can go to raw files, JPEG fine, JPEG normal, JPEG basic, raw plus basic. If you're here to learn to be a better photographer, shoot raw, edit and post. The JPEGs, all of them, even the highest quality, add compression. The raw files are the data from the sensor. You can edit that with any, even some affordable and or free photo editors now. The purpose of the JPEGs back in the day was that data was expensive. A 32 gigabyte SD card when this camera came out was I think it was $130 when I bought one for my camera back in 2007. Very expensive. So people would buy like 128 meg CF cards because they were like $20, or SD cards rather. And with that, if you use a 128 meg SD card, raw files, you're going to be filling that up very quickly. So you'd use JPEGs and shoot JPEGs just because memory was so much more expensive. Memory is cheap now. And then, so shoot raw. Raw plus basic JPEG was used for Windows XP, Windows 7, things like Windows 2000 that could not display thumbnails of raw files. Windows 10, Windows 11, and I would assume any future version of Windows can take the raw NEF files that Nikon cameras produce and show thumbnails of them, so you don't need raw plus JPEG anymore. This one below it is grayed out, and that is, because if I select JPEG, now I can select the JPEG size, large, medium, or small. Large is the full sensor, medium is a 4 megapixel, and small is a 1.9 megapixel image. If you are shooting JPEG and you select one of these smaller ones, you will never go back to the full size image, because these take that full size image and they downsample them to smaller images, and they just delete all of that added resolution data. So if you're going to shoot JPEG, shoot large, and you'll have the maximum data that you can have from your JPEG images. Next here is white balance, and these are the different white balance modes: auto, tungsten, fluorescent, full sun, flash, shade, cloudy, shade, pre, we'll talk about that at the end. Auto is just auto. The camera looks at the scene in front of it and says, what do I think this is? What do I think the lighting is? What colors and algorithms do I need to apply to make a white look white? And the camera is usually pretty good about that. Tungsten says to the camera, hey, I'm going to be shooting under tungsten light. It's very warm color, like an amber, right? And the camera will say, okay, I'm going to add a bunch of blue to your images to counter that warm tungsten light. And so tungsten isn't used so much anymore, but I guess if you wanted to make a photo look like it was underwater, you could do that way. Fluorescent is used under fluorescent lighting. Fluorescent creates a very green color, so your camera will apply magenta to your images to counter that green color from the fluorescent lights. Full sun tells your camera you're going to be outside under full sun and to expect full spectrum light, and it will adjust the white balance accordingly. Flash is for any flash you would use. This is a xenon bulb. In flashes with reusable bulbs use xenon, and it creates a very blue light. So the camera will add a bunch of yellow to your photos to counter the blueness of the xenon bulb. Cloudy tells the camera you're going to be outside on an overcast day. Full spectrum of light but filtered through clouds, and the camera will apply white balance accordingly. And shade tells the camera it's a full sunny day, full spectrum of light, but I'm in the shade of a building, tree, something like that, and the camera will apply color corrections based on the color cast that shade adds to images. Now we get down here to pre, and the sample photo for pre is interesting. It's a person holding a white card. With pre, in video 3, we'll get to a section where you can record an image for this. In this mode, you just simply select this, and the camera will apply what it has learned from that photo that is taken in the menus, okay? With this, what you would do in conjunction with what we'll talk about in video 3 is, let's say you have a tabletop studio, okay? You use a white backdrop, and you use solid state lighting. You would take a picture of that white backdrop before you put anything in it that you want to sell online. And the camera will say, with the lighting I see, knowing this is a white background, what color toning do I have to add to this image to make this white white? And then it will. And when you save that and use that white balance setting in here, what you can do is you can take all of these different things you're going to sell. You're selling like 24 different things, and they're all different, very bright colors. Well, if you didn't have a preset white balance, all of those different colors would be absorbed somewhat, what we call color splash, onto that white background during the photos, and it could very easily throw off your auto white balance. This will allow you to, for your lighting setting, have a specific white balance, and so that across your entire photo shoot of all of those 24 things you're going to sell that are different colors, the colors will all be balanced accurately because the white will have been balanced accurately. All right, that's the point of this. The same thing can apply if you're doing a portrait shoot in a studio or at a corporate setting. Just take a photo of a white piece of paper in your portrait studio setup with this balanced and then select your pre-balanced preset white balance, and then people's skin tones and clothes will all have an accurate color balance across the entire photo shoot. So that's what that's for. Next up is ISO, and you can select anything from 100 up to 3200, which they call high 1. Just come in here and select your ISO. With a camera of this age, going much beyond 400 is fine if you want to convert to black and white, okay? Because you're going to get a lot of digital color noise in the 800 to 3200 ISO images, and converting to black and white will mask that color noise and make it look like digital texture instead. So just a tip on that. Next here we have your function buttons. Next here we have your drive mode. This is how your shutter is going to operate, okay? Single shutter mode is you press down the shutter button and the camera will take a picture. You can keep holding the shutter button until your hand turns to dust, and guess what? It will never take another photo. Continuous is you hold down the shutter button and the camera will shoot at 3 frames per second until it runs out of buffer, and then it will just shoot slowly over and over again until you fill up the CF card. This is your self-timer for 10 seconds. In video 3, I'll show you how to adjust this time, but self-timer turns the shutter button into a self-timer start. This is your remote control with 2 seconds. So if you hit the remote control, the camera will wait 2 seconds and take a photo. And this is your remote control with instantaneous release. So if you're using a remote and just want the camera to take a picture right away, that's your mode. So that's what the different drive modes do. This next one is called autofocus. Here's your autofocus selection. You have four choices: autofocus automatic, single, continuous, and manual focus. So manual focus is super simple to understand. If you select manual focus, you have to adjust the focus ring on your camera lens to obtain focus. The camera will not focus for you. Now, autofocus automatic will automatically choose between S and C depending on what's in front of the camera. So the camera will constantly evaluate what it's taking photos of and determine which of these two modes to use. Autofocus single or servo or whatever the Nikon calls it, what S does is the camera is going to assume you're taking a picture of something stationary, landscape, portrait, still life, something like that. Once it locks autofocus, the focus won't shift and the camera will take the picture when you are ready to take the picture. In autofocus continuous, the camera expects that what you're taking a photo of will be moving and it will use the autofocus to track a moving subject. So that's the difference between these is moving subject, stationary subject, automatic selection of whether the camera thinks your subject is stationary or moving. Here is your focus, your autofocus area. And we'll talk, I forget the names of these, we'll see them in the third video. Basically it's like wide, or it's automatic or wide or something like that, middle, and then spot. So basically with the top one, your camera will automatically pick the autofocus area that's needed for what it thinks is in subject. Oh, this is closest subject, that's what it's called. In this mode, the camera will find the closest subject on your autofocus points, focus on that subject and take photos of that closest subject. This is your narrower autofocus, where the camera will look for something that's moving in the center of the frame. And this is your spot autofocus, where the camera will use the center autofocus point to hone in on something very specific that's that you want in your photo. So those are the three different autofocus modes. This last one is your metering mode. And there are three options: matrix, center weighted, and spot. Okay. Matrix is a good general use metering mode. What it does is it looks all around your image at the bright stuff up here and the dark stuff in here and the midtone stuff in here. And it says, based on the balance of brights and darks and stuff that's in focus, what's far away, what's close, etc., what shutter speed and aperture do I give my photographer to give him or her the best photo that I can take? That's what this does. For most settings, this is really good. Nikon's matrix metering is exceptional. Next one is center weighted. The way that center weighted works is it looks in an area in the center part of the frame, and then the majority of the meter reading comes from that center part, and the minority comes from everything outside of it. So, for instance, if you have a very bright flower in the center of your image and very dark greenery around it, you might want to use this to get a proper exposure for your flower, but also some detail in the greens around it. Center weighted is a really good metering mode when you are center composing images. Spot is the most powerful metering mode you've got. It's very powerful because what it does is 100% of the metering information comes from a small area in the very center of the frame. So spot metering allows you to take a very precise meter reading and then dial in manual selections for your shutter speed and aperture and have consistent settings. I'm going to show you how this works, then I'll explain a situation where you'd want to use it. When I make these videos, I start each video with a gray card like this in the middle, and I take a spot meter reading and then lock in my exposure settings. The reason I do this is because the camera looks at this gray card and it says, I want to make what is inside of the small circle at the very middle here the shade of gray that this card is. So doing this will tell the camera exactly what a midtone gray should be with the lighting that I have. If I used a different color card, say white, the camera's going to try to make the white card gray. And in order to make the white card gray, it's got to make everything dark. That's why everything you're looking at just got dark. You can probably guess where this is going to go, and I hope you're not sitting in a dark room right now. But if we use a black card, it's going to try to make that black card gray. Everything's going to be super, super bright, okay? So with spot metering, what you can do is you can, say, take a gray card, and you can have someone, you can do your tabletop studio setup. Take your gray card. You've got your auto white balance saved. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take a spot meter reading off that gray card in the center of your tabletop studio. You're going to dial in a manual shutter speed and exposure. And all of your images will have the exact same exposure. They will all have the exact same color balance. So when you open up that that big group of images that you're going to take for your tabletop studio, and you open it up on your computer, they all have the exact same settings. You can make adjustments to one of those files, the very first one, apply them to every single file, and bingo, all of your images will come out looking the same with the same exposure and the same color balance. You can do that in a portrait studio as well. So portrait studio, if you do this, if you shoot people who are very pale and very dark in the same shoot, their skin tones will be appropriate for the lighting that you have and will accurately reflect their actual skin tones. So this is a really good way to take control over your metering and have predictable results across a shoot when you have controlled lighting. That's just one way to use spot metering. There are other ways, but I think that's the easiest way to understand how it functions. And with that, we have actually covered everything in this screen. AEL, AFL we'll talk about in video 3. So the next thing that we have to talk about with this camera is what you see when you look through the viewfinder, okay? So if you pull up your D60 and look in the viewfinder, you're going to see this screen right here. Not all of this information is going to be lit up. This is the maximum amount of information you could possibly see. What you see here is your focusing area, your image composition area, focusing screen. But basically what you see here is essentially what's going to be in your image. These are your 3 autofocus areas. In order for the autofocus to focus on something, it has to be in one of these 3 spots. If something's down here, autofocus isn't going to see it and it's not going to focus on it, okay? These 3 spots only. Now down here, and by the way, this information comes from the page 7 of the manual if you would like to follow along and check it. But down here, what we have is everything you could potentially see in the information bar of your focusing screen. Number 2 here, this is your focus confirmation dot. If this is lit up, something is in focus. There is a thing in one of these 3 areas that is in focus. That's what that means. 12 here is your battery. Number 3 is your focus point display and autofocus mode indicator, okay? So this is going to tell you which focus points are potentially active and what your autofocus mode is going to be, okay? So you can look in here and you can see these 3 points line up with these 3, correspond rather with these 3 autofocus points, and that's going to give you some information about that. EL is your auto exposure lock indicator. If you're using auto exposure lock, which we'll talk about in video 3 when we go through the menu items, this will be lit up. Star P is what's called the flexible program indicator. Since I don't shoot in the scene modes or green box, I honestly can't tell you what conditions that this shows up in. But it shows up when there's some flexible program stuff going on. It's just an informational thing. So whatever this is indicating, it's just providing information. It's not something that should be critical for most shooting situations. This is your shutter speed display. And what the inch indicator over here is your inches, or your seconds rather. This is a fractional dot which will show up if you are using like a 1.06 or 1.1 second shutter speed or something. Other than that, if this says 4,000, it's a 4,000th of a second shutter speed. But this displays your shutter speed. The F here indicates that this displays your aperture setting. This is your light meter. It works exactly like the light meter we saw on the LCD screen earlier in the video. Over here, big time overexposure, big time underexposure. Your goal, if you're using manual mode looking through the viewfinder, is to get the light under the 0, illuminated. If the light is way over here, or the further it is away from the 0 in this direction, the more overexposed your image is going to be. The further away it is from the 0 in this direction, the more underexposed it's going to be, okay? In the automatic and semi-automatic modes, the line will be under the 0 unless you're doing exposure value compensation or bracketing. When you bracket, you'll get three lines in here. We'll talk about bracketing in the 3rd video. This is your flash value exposure compensation, and this will illuminate if you're using exposure compensation for your flash. This is your standard exposure value compensation indicator and will illuminate if you're using exposure value compensation with either your shutter speed or aperture. ISO auto indicates that you are using automatic ISO, but if you're using a specific number, that number will display here. Item number 10 here is your exposure counter. So, or actually it does a whole lot of things, I shouldn't just say that. If you're using exposure compensation, this will indicate how much over and under your exposure compensation is. this will also tell you how many photos you have remaining. If that K is lit up, whatever number you see in here, plus 1,000 or more, okay? That K indicates you have more than 1,000 photos remaining on your SD card. Flash indicator indicates your flash is ready to fire. And number 16 here is your warning indicator, which indicates something is wrong you've got to correct before the camera can take a photo or take a photo that's properly exposed. And with all of that understood, the next thing that we want to talk about is how to take a photo with the camera. We want to put this all together, okay? The camera is designed so that you dial in all of your settings ahead of time. You're going to select your mode, your aperture, your shutter speed, or whichever of those parameters you can select based on your mode. You're going to do all of your menu setup ahead of time. You're going to go through the info screen and select the different functions that we just spent a whole bunch of time talking about. And then when you go to take a photo, you simply hold the camera up to your eye, push the shutter button, and it will take a photo. So all you have to worry about when you use this camera is the moment at which you will take the photo if you have dialed all of your settings in correctly. That's it. So that is everything that we've got for this video. In the next video, there's a card for it here. We'll go through the entire menu system and I'll talk about how to configure each menu item and what it does for your photography.